mass with our council members.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for being here. This is Lisa. It's a little after 3. We're going to get started here in just a second.
Okay, I got to step away just for 1 minute. I'll be right back. I haven't had a break all afternoon, and I just need to take a quick break.
I hear you. I will not make your roll call while you're gone. All right, we're just going to give it another minute before we get started. You are at the 3rd meeting of the Michigan Council on Climate Solutions, and we are glad you've joined us. All right, I'm seeing a lot of council member names, so I think we're getting close enough to critical mass that we can start. So thanks everybody for joining. My name is Lisa Clark. I'm the Director of Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. You are at the 3rd meeting of the Michigan Council on Climate Solutions. I hope you wanted to be with us. If you didn't, we're glad you're here. Please stay. So we're going to start by just doing a little bit of business. We're going to run through attendance and adopt the agenda and do the meeting minutes, and then we'll get started with the meat of the discussion today. We are focused, as the slide says up front, on the building and housing discussion as part of our conversation for here today. So before I go through and do attendance, I just wanted to remind folks that we're meeting the 4th Tuesday of the month through 2021, so keep that date on your calendar. I also wanted to ask everybody to please do the usual, keeping yourself on mute, much appreciated. We are glad that we have a lot of participation from folks outside of the council, but I just want to remind everybody that the opportunity for discussion here is for council members. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the public meetings that we've been having. That's a great opportunity for participation. And we're very interested in your participation. Also, the work groups, another great place for participation. So the opportunity for discussion and feedback here is for council members, but we're glad for those of you that aren't council members that you've joined us and that you're participating as well. So we're going to start today by running through attendance, and then we'll come back to the agenda. So I'm going to pull up the list, and we'll just work our way through alphabetically. So I'm going to start with Paul Ajiba from MDOT. All right, do we have an MDOT sub? Maybe Niles is on with us?
Yes, this is Niles. I'm here. Thank you.
Thanks, Niles.
Yeah, thank you.
Frank Beaver.
I am present.
Great, thanks, Frank. We had the head of MEDC, but there's a kind of ongoing effort to replace the CEO over there. So I'm wondering if maybe Steve Bacall's joined us from MEDC.
Good afternoon, Steve Bacall here.
Hey, thanks for being here, Steve. And then I'm going to go to Susan Corbin. Okay, do we have a substitute from Leo, Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity?
Hi, Liesl. Judd here.
Hi, Judd. Judd, why didn't I have you? I had you lower. Sorry. Thank you for being here, Judd. Okay, Mary Draves. Mary, see, I did it. I waited till you were back.
Awesome. I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Carrie Dugan. Carrie, I saw your name. Are you with us? Okay, I think Carrie's here because I saw her sign on. She has some internet challenges in her home office too, which could be a problem. So next is Dan Eichinger, but I know he was not available to participate today. So I think Scott Whitcomb is here in his stead. Is that right, Scott?
That's right. I'm here sitting in for Dan.
Great. Nice to see you, sir.
You too.
And then Treasurer Eubanks.
Present.
Hi. And then next we've got Jim Harrison.
Hi, Lisa. I'm here.
Great. Hi, Jim. It's funny. I saw your picture at first, then you disappeared for a while. Now you're back. Okay. Next I've got Director Hertel from DHHS. Maybe I have a substitute. Megan Groen.
Yeah. Good
Thanks.
afternoon.
Hi, Megan. All right. Next I've got Brandon Hoffmeister from Consumers.
I'm here.
Great. And then Marnice Jackson.
Present.
Hi, Marnice. Next, I've got Gary McDowell.
Good afternoon, Director. It's Josh Neihart. I'll be playing the role of Director McDowell today.
Thank you, sir. You're even close to him in the alphabet, so you've got that N last name. So,
Perfect.
all right. But before we go too much further to the O's, we're going to call on Phyllis Meadows. Phyllis, are you with us?
I am here.
Great. And then Peck knows he's coming up next.
Happy to be here.
Nice to see you. And then I've got Tanya Pozlowski.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Hey, Tanya. We have great attendance, folks. Cynthia Render Williams.
Present.
Great. I'm glad to see you, Cynthia. And I'm going to tell everybody who might not have been on that Ford had a big announcement today about their Ion Park. So if you haven't checked it out yet, go check that one out. Next, I've got Phil Roos.
And
Hi, Phil. And then I've got Chairman Scripps.
I am here.
And next is Darrell Slaughter.
I am here.
Great. And Sam Stolper.
Hi, I'm here.
And then poor Mr. Vogelweed way down there at the V's. Are you with us, Ron?
Yes, I am.
Great. Last and never least. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Let me go back up. Anybody who was not able to say here while we went through attendance that wants to announce themselves? Okay. All righty. So first, we're going to adopt the agenda. So you should all have the agenda in front of you. I think you received it on the 23rd. Fairly simple structure today. We're going to run through a work group update, talk about the buildings and housing space, and we've got some presentations. So what we've tried to structure is an opportunity for you to hear from the work group just at a high level because they're early in their process. And then a comprehensive discussion about the buildings and housing space. And then we've set it up so that we've got an opportunity for some back and forth, and then we'll wrap up. So we're hoping this is a good structure following on the last meeting to give you an opportunity for input. First, I guess I'm going to ask for a motion to put the agenda in front of us.
So move.
Thanks, Darrell. Do we have a second?
second.
Bill? Thank you, sir. Any discussion on today's agenda? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposition? All right, so the agenda's in front of us. Thank you. Next, let's do the meeting minutes. I also received the meeting minutes. Let's see, you got them on the 23rd. So this is from the March 23rd meeting. Just going to remind folks that our process is to make sure that we've got the meeting minutes right to get them adopted here at the council meeting and then to get them up on the website. So that's the process you'll see. So once, assuming they're approved today, once they're approved, we'll get them posted up to the website. So for those of you who might be following along, that's our process. So let's first get them in front of us. Do I have a motion to put the meeting minutes in front of us?
So move.
I'll second.
Support then.
All right, I'm going to go. I saw Darrell's hand and then I think I heard Mary.
Yes.
Great. Any discussion on the meeting minutes? Anything folks saw that they wanted to comment on? Okay, great. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposition? Great. All right. So just a few kind of comments at the front to get us all on the same page, and then we'll get into the presentations here quickly. So I wanted to mention, first of all, that as I said early on, and as we told you at the last meeting, we've started listening sessions to make sure there's an opportunity up front to receive comment from the general public around climate. So we had that first listening session to get comments on the My Healthy Climate Plan on April 22nd. So Earth Day, it was apropos. We had 140 some people participate, and we did receive lots of comments. I know some of you council members participated as well, so thank you for taking time out of your busy calendars to do that. There's a recording available that's on our website at michigan.gov/climate. So you can check that out there if you're interested. Our second listening session is set up for May 5th This one's going to be in the evening. We were trying to make sure that we could catch different groups of people with different times of the day. So if you're able, it'll be at 6 p.m. And again, for those council members, we'll send that out for anybody else who is listening in and wants to offer comment. You'll find that on our website at michigan.gov/climate. So good place to go and watch all things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work groups. Obviously, we've been having some ongoing conversation here and just wanted to spend a minute on work group overview. So this next slide is going to show you, just remind everybody the work group setup. So these are the 5 different work groups that we're using, and you can see the co-chairs that are represented here. You recall that we covered energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage in that first meeting, and now we're on buildings and housing. So just wanted to mention that to all of you. You can see, well, I'm gonna, oh, sorry, Andy, go back for 1 second. So you can see the other 3 work groups here, and we'll show you in a slide next, or in one of the next slides, we'll show you the participation in some of these early work group meetings. So very appreciative of the folks that have been running these. So we, again, as I had mentioned earlier, we've been working with Great Plains Institute, who's been helping us kind of keep all of the balls in the air. But a ton of the work has been done by the co-chairs. And so we're very grateful for these individuals who are giving up their time and energy to help really move this process forward. So on the next slide, you'll see how the objectives have been set up for the work groups. And I know some of the council members have been talking to work group chairs or participating in some of these work group conversations. All the council members received an email late last week, or maybe it was the week before. Sorry, the days run together. You received an email that gave you all the meeting contact information for the work groups. If you're having trouble with any of that, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to make sure that you're able to access anything that you want to participate in. So the objectives here are to develop a baseline understanding of current carbon emission levels, opportunities and barriers around reducing emissions, and equity considerations. The second, discuss decarbonization strategies in consideration of opportunities and barriers. And then the third, to develop a bulleted list of recommendations for what needs to happen in the next 9 years by 2030 to achieve Michigan's 2050 climate goal. So this is your structure that's been consistent among the work groups, and we'll provide more updates to the council as time goes on, but just wanted to touch base on this. And then you'll see on the next slide, all the work groups have been meeting, and we've had a lot of participation. So really grateful for that interest. We had, I think, more than 500 people sign up to be work group members. We're not soliciting additional work group participation just because we do have so many moving parts there. And I know that some folks have said, all right, now that I understand the work group process, I'm going to spend more time here and not spend time here. But we do, really appreciate how much time folks are spending to be part of these conversations. So just wanted to loop back with the council and talk about that process and where we're at with all that work. And make sure that you all were updated on the work groups. So I think, let's see. I also wanted to mention that the work group co-chairs are meeting with the Climate Justice Brain Trust this week. So that's been an important dialogue, and this will be the first conversation for those groups directly to have a conversation about working justice and equity issues into the work group effort. So we talked a little bit about that in the first meeting as well as in the second meeting. So just wanted to share a little bit on that with all of you. Today, though, we're turning over the page and looking at opportunities in the building and housing space. So I think that when we talk about climate efforts, I know that many of this group are understanding that we can make some of our fastest and surest progress around reducing our greenhouse gas footprint here when it comes to energy efficiency and demand response. Energy efficiency is a wonderful tool that's necessary to address climate change, enhance public health, support the economy, create jobs, and save businesses and residents money. When you think about the opportunities in the building and housing space, it's something that, and it's such an important change can have a lasting impact out over time. And so that's part of the reason why it is kind of one of the most impactful areas really for policy discussion. And then when you think about it from a comprehensive perspective, we see improvements to buildings enhancing public health, enhancing quality of life. There's an opportunity here to save businesses and families money over time. It creates jobs and benefits the economy and just enhances the energy system overall. So from lighting and HVAC systems to building design, smart technologies, and even incorporating the structure and the changes to our transportation system, these policies will help reduce carbon pollution and cut energy costs. We know that all these forms of energy generation and reduction have to fit together for this complete puzzle to support our everyday use, because our businesses and our residents really depend on them. So before we go into the presentations for today, I wanted to introduce to all of you the two co-chairs. And so I'm going to start with Charlotte. Charlotte, I hope you're with us and you can turn your video on and say a couple of words to the council.
Hey, yeah, everybody. This is Charlotte Jamison. I am the program director for legislative affairs, energy and drinking water for the Michigan Environmental Council. And I've been doing work in the energy space in Michigan for going on 8 years now. And I've been heavily involved with a group of environmental, housing, public health advocates called the Michigan Energy Efficiency for All coalition that's been advocating for energy efficiency, particularly in low-income multifamily housing. And I am super excited to be involved in leading this work group with Karen. And I'm looking forward to all of the really great presentations that we're going to be having and discussions at that work group over the next few months.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlotte. And now I'm going to turn it over to Karen Gould to say hello.
Hi, all. I'm Karen Gould. I'm with the Michigan Public Service Commission. I've been with the commission for almost 15 years now, but more importantly, 10 years have been spent on the legislation that enacted our energy efficiency requirements for Michigan's utilities. And I don't think 10 years ago we could have imagined that we would be here today with some of the, really robust and technologically advanced programs that have been offered. And so I'm really excited to see how we can take that from here to 10 years from now. What we'll be looking back and really, appreciative of the milestones we've made in energy efficiency. I agree with everything Lisa said about energy efficiency. And I think we're going to get a lot of good outcomes from this work group. It's already been some great conversations and just a joy to work on. So looking forward to working with this group going forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. And thank you to Charlotte. Really appreciate the two of you working together. Just as a reminder for folks, I should have said this on the earlier slide, we do have a state of Michigan person and a stakeholder person, so that we're getting perspectives from within the state as well as from without the state in all of these work groups. So really appreciate the work that you both are doing on that. So I'm going to keep us on schedule. I'm already 3 minutes over. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dan Oss, who's with Energy and Environmental Economics. And Dan, we're just thrilled to have you present here today. I will hand it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, both the state and the rest of the group for listening to me here today. My name is Dan Oss. I'm a director at E3, and I'm going to work on pulling my slides up as I tell you a little bit about what we're going to present today. Are my slides visible to the group?
Yep, looks good. You can do the presenter. Yeah, great.
All right, fantastic. So brief agenda today, just a little bit about us. I'll talk about different building decarbonization pathways, and I'm going to really focus on two alternative, but in some cases complementary strategies of, on the one hand, decarbonizing the fuels that are currently being used in buildings, on the other hand, electrifying the end uses that are currently served by fuels like natural gas or propane. And then I'll offer some sort of concluding thoughts and open questions that you all might consider as you're going through this planning process. So just quickly about us, E3 is a smallish consulting firm with offices across North America, including in Calgary in Canada. And we're really sort of solely focused on technical consulting for the clean energy transition, as we call it, across all sectors of the economy. We're kind of pretty wide variety of backgrounds, but mostly our focus is technical and strategy related to decarbonization. And our relevant experience here is that we've looked at building decarbonization pathways and strategies in a wide variety of settings across North America. Our headquarters is in San Francisco, California. So of course we've done a lot of work in the Bay Area and across California. But we found in doing work elsewhere, as you go say to the right of this chart, that the story around building decarbonization can vary quite a bit. California is a warm, very mild climate. You go to the other end of the spectrum, a place like Minnesota, you get a place that's much, much colder and has a different set of challenges when it comes to building decarbonization. And every state and every jurisdiction we look at has its own unique features, and taking those unique features into account is a critical part of the type of work that we do and the type of work that you're ensuing upon. So I'm going to start with a high-level description of building decarbonization pathways. And Liesl had a really nice introduction on the importance of energy efficiency, and I want to underscore that energy efficiency is just a critical central component of any strategy to decarbonize buildings, as well as decarbonizing electricity. So, buildings are currently one of the larger consumers of electricity, and we'll need to decarbonize electricity supply in order to decarbonize buildings. But what I want to focus on today is how we heat our buildings. So really the direct use of fuels in buildings. It's typically going to be natural gas in more of urban and suburban areas, but in more rural areas, it'll be a wider variety of fuels, propane, kerosene, fuel oil, and others. And when we're thinking about heating our buildings and decarbonizing the heat supply, there's a few different paths you could consider taking. So one of those paths are decarbonized gases or decarbonized fuels. And this is things like renewable natural gas or hydrogen that you'll, I'm sure, heard about to varying levels of extent. And these fuels have some key advantages in that they are able to repurpose existing infrastructure. And what we mean by that is that your gas furnace or your water heater or your stove can continue to operate much the way that it has historically. And similarly, use things like utility infrastructure, gas utility pipelines in most cases, can be repurposed as well and used to deliver just a decarbonized form of what they already provide. So those are the advantages, but those advantages come with some trade-offs. The first is cost. So these decarbonized gases or decarbonized fuels are going to be more costly, and I'll walk through what that looks like in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides. But they're also not commercial at scale. So the processes to create these decarbonized fuels, the sort of the chemical engineering of it is well understood, but the turning of that sort of basic engineering and scientific principles into actual industries, with big manufacturing plants and people working in them, has not happened yet. So it's important to acknowledge that it would require sort of building something up from sort of the bottom in order to deploy the level and the scale of fuels that we would need to decarbonize our buildings. So what's an alternative pathway to decarbonize gases or decarbonize fuels? Well, one that you hear out there in the world and one that's really point of emphasis for many folks is electrification. And when we talk about electrification, we're talking about taking a current sort of gas or fuel oil or propane appliance and converting it to some electric alternative. Typically, what we're talking about in buildings is converting space heating and water heating to a heat pump, which is essentially can be thought of as an air conditioner in reverse that moves energy that's in the air outside inside the building using electricity. But for other uses, things like your stove, it might be something like an induction stove or an electric dryer. And we're really talking about these conversions of either end uses or entire buildings. And where this gets advantageous is that we're relying largely on commercially available products in many cases, not in all. So, you can go out and buy a heat pump for your home today. And there's also many heat pumps available for commercial applications as well. It's complementary to decarbonized electricity. So I think over the last decade, we've come to understand that decarbonizing electricity is sort of the linchpin of achieving any economy-wide decarbonization target, and that we can actually do it more cost effectively and quicker than we had perhaps anticipated 15 or 20 years ago. And so building electrification really is complementary to the path that the electric sector needs to go on, no matter what happens. But there are drawbacks to this as well. For instance, on the consumer side, in many cases, a heat pump is going to require some additional upfront costs for a consumer. That's not true in all cases, though it is in some. So if you have a particularly old home, or if you are, have a more complicated retrofit, it might be the case that you're spending some extra money on the consumer side, and that's a challenge to overcome. There's also, in a place like Michigan with a relatively cold climate, the question of the peak load impacts on the electricity system. And I'll talk more about those in subsequent slides. There's also, when you're thinking about the gas side of the equation, because really what we're talking about here is sort of removing load from the gas utilities and transforming over to electric utilities, there's also important questions about stranded assets of the gas system. So to what extent are all the pipes and infrastructure that have been deployed there going to be able to be collected, the cost of those going to be able to collect it over time? And what are the related workforce impacts for the large numbers of good paying union gas utility jobs if you were to pursue this path? So there's a number of other important considerations as well that are worth considering. But I don't want to pose those two options as being sort of impossible to reconcile with one another and a true fork in the road. We think that there are probably combinations of decarbonized gases and electrification that could make sense and could make some particular sense in a place like Michigan. Of course, this warrants further investigation. So one example is a hybrid system that uses a heat pump to heat the home during most hours of the year, but uses gas or other fuel backup as a form of sort of peaking resource. So that both helps mitigate electric sector impacts and also might help maintain a more comfortable home for the occupants during those really, really cold weathers, as well as maybe provide some resilience benefits as well, given that you're relying on two sources of heat rather than one. Drawbacks, so far is that it's not a super well studied strategy in the United States, though I would say it is an emerging strategy in Europe that has been well studied there, and there's a variety of different sort of pilot and early implementation examples from Europe that would be interesting for, I think, the state of Michigan to look at as well. Another kind of cool and emerging idea is the idea of district heating, particularly this idea of a geothermal microdistrict is what the folks in Massachusetts are calling it. It's sort of a world in which you're repurposing, say, the infrastructure of the gas utility, the rights of way, and the skill sets of the gas utility employees to essentially heat buildings via shared geothermal system. So essentially you have a geothermal borehole. Several buildings are connected to it via pipes that distribute hot water, which are then converted into heat for the buildings that use them. So again, not a well-studied option in the US, though it is an emerging strategy in both Europe, and there's some really interesting pilots happening in Massachusetts right now that are worth tracking as well. All right, so I'll turn next to decarbonized gases. So the organizers asked me to spend a little time talking about what decarbonized gases are, what their trade-offs are, how they're made, and what they might cost in the long run. So you can think about breaking decarbonized gases into several different types of fuels. The cheapest and probably the one that is most accessible in the near term is called biomethane. So this is a form of carbon neutral methane that can be produced from things like waste forest products, agricultural products, landfill gases, or manure. So the idea here being that we're still burning a methane molecule at whatever end use is using it, but we're recapturing on a life cycle basis the CO2 by growing new crops and new plants back in their place. You can also use purpose-grown energy crops. So this are things like miscanthus, switchgrass, that type of stuff. But there's important sort of interactions with life cycle emissions, indirect emission impacts that are important to consider here, though there could be opportunities to reuse lands that are currently devoted to growing, say, ethanol crops for ethanol that could be repurposed or diverted to producing alternative types of decarbonized fuels like biomethane. Biomethane is limited in quantity. There's only so much waste biomass out there in the country. There's only so much land. There's competition for land between agricultural purposes that create food versus energy. So this kind of a heuristic you could use that maybe 10% or so of current heating energy demand in buildings could be displaced by biomethane, maybe as high as 20% under a certain set of assumptions. But if you want to deeply decarbonize heating, meaning get it beyond sort of initial small cuts of emissions reductions, you have to think about alternative fuels or additional fuels. And the next one that I think comes to mind is hydrogen. And hydrogen is just an alternative molecule that can be blended into pipelines. And if it's produced via what's called a green hydrogen process, which is essentially using some sort of zero carbon electricity like wind or solar, potentially hydroelectric power as well, to electrolyze, to use an electrolysis of water process, so essentially producing a hydrogen molecule using green energy. You can also produce hydrogen via a blue process, as it's called, which is essentially similar to how hydrogen is produced today, which is via a process called steam methane reformation. However, in this process, instead of sort of allowing the CO2 to be an emission as it is today, you apply carbon capture to make this a lower form, although not a zero carbon form of hydrogen that can be used in places like buildings. But hydrogen has some limitations as well. Which is that you'd have to do fairly substantial retrofits of both customer and utility infrastructure to blend it, much above sort of 7% of the total energy delivered in the pipeline. So there's some important considerations there. And so if you are thinking about blending hydrogen or using hydrogen, you have to take into account its limitations as well. But it's well worth having in mind. Sorry, this is a little bit of a busy graph, but essentially all it's telling you is that the cost to produce hydrogen, the infrastructure, the electrolyzers, the sort of key component to it, are expected to fall over time, and that the delivered cost of hydrogen on the right is also expected to fall. And if you're interested in a deeper dive on this, there's a number of reports by E3 and others. There's one linked here that will be in the materials on sort of the role of hydrogen in a deeply decarbonized future that we've produced. And there's a lot of really interesting material out there to talk about hydrogen. But if hydrogen is sort of limited in its ability to be blended into gas pipelines, we have to think about, okay, what else are we going to blend in there? So as I've said, we've kind of have 10 to 20% biomethane, maybe another 7% hydrogen. Okay, where's the other 70 to 80% of decarbonized gas going to come from? And the sort of potential last resource, the one that maybe is less limited, is a product called synthetic natural gas, which you'll notice in this figure looks very similar to hydrogen at the start, which is because we're basically producing hydrogen, and then we're combining it with a form of carbon neutral CO2. So I won't get into too much detail on what that means, but essentially you want to have a source of CO2 that isn't emitting net emissions into the atmosphere at the end of the day. You go through what's called a methanation process, and at the end of the day you get a carbon neutral methane molecule that you can then use in your existing pipeline infrastructure. And so this is the one that is probably the furthest away from commercialization and probably the most speculative, but is less limited fundamentally by either the sort of supply of biomass like biomethane or the ability to blend it into the pipeline like hydrogen. So putting it all together, we've done work to think about what a decarbonized gas supply curve would look like. And this is an example from California, though we've done this in a variety of other jurisdictions, including other states in the upper Midwest. And I would say that, before I get into what's going on here, those are fairly similar in those jurisdictions to what you see here. But basically the idea being the green is the biomethane. There's only so much of it. It's also the lowest cost. The hydrogen can only be used in limited quantities. And then the orange and red are, ones that you can rely on to a larger extent, but are much more expensive. So I didn't orient you on the graph, which do that on the tail end. The y-axis is the cost of the fuel. The x-axis is the supply. And then you can compare the cost of any given point on this curve to the forecasted price of natural gas in this dotted gray line here that's horizontal. And the basic idea being these gases are all substantially more expensive than natural gas is today. So I got about one more minute, so I'll just go quickly through electrification and some of the trade-offs of electrification and the potential grid impact. So proposals to electrify heating really focus on air source heat pumps. So there are other technologies like ground source heat pumps that are worth mentioning. And the sort of value proposition here is that they're really very efficient at heating COPs of 3 or higher. I said Washington State there today, but it'd be similar in Michigan as well, perhaps a little bit lower. But the key sort of challenge of air source heat pumps is that their efficiencies fall as the outdoor air temperature drops. That's exactly the same time when the building heating demands are at their highest. So on those really cold winter days, you're getting less efficient heating from your heat pump and your loads are going up. And so what that means is heat pumps are typically installed with supplemental heat that are used during the coldest hours of the year. So in an all-electric home, that supplemental heat will typically be provided by sort of an electric resistance element in the home, while cold climate models are out there that rely on less of it. So basically what you're seeing here on this graph on the left is the load of a heat pump on the y-axis for a single home as a function of outdoor air temperature on the x-axis. And you can see this kind of distinct outcomes between sort of a standard heat pump, what I describe as sort of a Carter administration heat pump, and a cold climate heat pump, this blue curve that essentially has less load for any given temperature. And if you think about this at scale, we've done work on New York and New England, thinking about what this would look like if you added up all those individual homes and thought about what the system load would look like. And what you can get to is a world in which you have some very, very high loads on the electric system. And potentially moving a state like Michigan that is currently a summer peaking state into one that would be decidedly winter peaking. And there are sort of important electricity infrastructure considerations to take into account with such a shift in mind. Given that over time, I'll just skip to some concluding thoughts, but I have a few other open questions on the previous slide that y'all can look at in the materials that will be distributed. But in sum, I just want to boil it down to our conclusions generally are that decarbonized gases can have an important role in decarbonizing building end uses, but they are costlier than natural gas and are likely to be limited in scale and are commercially unproven. Heat pumps are a great option to efficiently heat buildings during most options of the year, but all electric buildings can cause large electric system impacts during the coldest hours. Our view is that in cold climates, lower cost, lower risk decarbonization strategies will likely require some combination of decarbonized fuels and electrification. So that's coming back to that hybrid strategy I mentioned before, where essentially electrification is providing a lower cost means to heat buildings during most hours of the year, but decarbonized fuels have an important role to deliver backup heat during the coldest hours. And just to reiterate again that while it wasn't an emphasis of this presentation, energy efficiency is just a critical core component of any strategy to decarbonize buildings anywhere in the US. So with that, I appreciate your time. Apologies for going a little bit over, and thank you again for having me.
It's almost like we planned it, Dan, where you end up by the energy efficiency bullet. So
yeah.
Great. Thanks for the presentation. Appreciate it. I think we're going to go ahead and have Jesse do that presentation right away too, and then we can take questions as we kind of work through council member discussion, if that's all right with everybody. So I'm excited now to introduce Jesse Wyatt from Great Plains Institute. And Jesse's going to take us through the decarbonization roadmap that the Mid-Continent Power Sector Collaboratives worked on. I hope that you'll see too from these presentations that there is an important body of work as a starting point for what we're doing here at the council, which, we've said a couple of times throughout this process, but, certainly stands out in the course of these two presentations. So Jesse, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, Dan, for that awesome primer to what I'm going to talk about today. So hello, everyone. Nice to be here today. Thank you for having me. My name is Jesse Wyatt. I'm an energy planner and analyst with the Great Plains Institute, and I have the pleasure of taking you on a whirlwind tour of some of the analysis and findings from the Mid-Continent Power Sector Collaborative Buildings Decarbonization Roadmap, known for the brevity of their publication titles. As you may or may not know, the Buildings Roadmap is actually, for some context, the third in a series following two others, the first which focused on the electricity sector, the second which focused on transportation electrification. All of these roadmap processes were facilitated by my colleague Franz Litz at GPI, and they're available for you to peruse at roadmap.betterenergy.org. The process for developing the roadmap was super collaborative. We had a ton of stakeholders across the Mid-Continent region, and actually a lot of Michigan representation, DTE Energy, the Ecology Center, Michigan Energy Innovation Business Council, Wolverine Power Cooperative, all signed on to it. And then there was also involvement from Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the Consumer Center. So your state folks were very represented and vocal in the development of the analysis and then the subsequent findings. So as we went through this process, there were a handful of high-level strategies available to tackle building decarbonization. You heard about some of them from Dan, and you'll see how each of these kind of thread through the presentation today. But in summary, the first, enhancing building design to be more energy efficient. I'm hearing, silent cheers from the audience. This is both through new construction and retrofits of existing building stock. So that was a huge focus of the work. The second, finding alternatives to fossil fuel, that's including electricity and renewable natural gas. And then the third was really technology innovation, so inclusive of both improvements in technology as well as deployments of said technologies. And you'll see that there ended up being a very strong emphasis on heat pumps through our findings. So this graphic provides a bit of contextual breakdown. An important piece of the way we approach the work was to understand, as is intuitive, as you seek to electrify things, the fuel mix behind that electricity becomes very important. So for context, we understand that in the Mid-Continent, which is serviced by the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO, with existing incentives and market forces, there is an increase in renewable energy and carbon-free generation to just over 50% by 2050. I did make this slide before the announcement came out of the Michigan Renewable Energy goal by 2025, so you guys are way ahead of the curve. But across the Mid-Continent, there still does remain quite a bit of ways to go to get to 100%. So I took out a ton of slides to keep this brief, but for those interested, the process used for modeling in the roadmaps was called the FACETS model. And we use that to analyze decarbonization scenarios. It utilizes, for those familiar, the EIA Annual Energy Outlook data, as well as the IEA Times modeling framework. And then, to put it bluntly, we ran a bunch of building decarbonization scenarios. So the figure you've been looking at while I've been talking depicts the complete range of emissions reductions that we found across all of our scenarios for residential buildings. So in some cases, we saw really significant reductions, the lower end of that bottom wedge of the graphic, while in other cases, we saw much smaller reductions in the realm of 10 million tons of CO2e. And that's small, especially considerate of the fact that we modeled out to mid-century or 2050. So you'll note there's two key colors on this graphic, right? And that's a distinction we found was really important in the outputs of the modeling, was that total emissions reductions were directly related to assumptions around heat pump performance technology. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but this is helpful just to frame up kind of, here's the breadth of ways that you can impact building emissions. What can we do to be most effective? Dan provided a lovely overview of heat pumps, so I won't belabor it. Here's a diagram showing kind of how air source heat pumps work. The majority of the rest of the slides go into heat pumps, and as I'm talking about them, we are talking about air source, which is where it's, well, Dan described. I'll leave it at that. We did, for those who I'll head off the question before I get it, we did include ground source heat pumps in the modeling as an available technology. However, because the model constrained as primary decision maker the fiscal or cost implications of a choice, the ground source heat pumps were very rarely chosen just because the upfront cost was so much greater than other technologies, and specifically air source heat pumps by comparison. So, across the thousands of scenarios we ended up running, we sought to isolate some of the key factors that ended up being most determinative of emissions reductions. And the result of that analysis was 4 scenarios. So the first sort of lever or impact was speed and rate of heat pump technology deployment across the Mid-Continent. And that captured both the advancements in heat pump technology as well as adoption rates. The second scenario was heat pump technology performance. So that's how Dan was describing, as it gets colder, heat pumps operate less efficiently. So the model assumed that there were 2 different types of heat pumps available. One was such that it required a backup fuel, as was described, as soon as the temperature hit 10 degrees, that backup fuel would kick in and the heat pump would turn off. And then the other heat pump performance option was called linear heat pump performance, meaning that as temperature declined and the efficiency of the heat pump decreased, the backup would match the marginal difference between demand and heat pump ability to supply. So you're able to rely on that heat pump a little bit longer, and backup is only kicking in as needed as opposed to just that cold shutoff. No pun intended. The third scenario was what we called a low investment hurdle rate. So hurdle rate is a term that we used to bundle sort of all of these proxy barriers that might prohibit a home from adopting a heat pump. So think education, think the upfront cost of the equipment, think labor, think general policy around training for heat pump installers. So all of that was sort of aggregated into one thing. Under baseline, we assumed that hurdle rate was called a 20% cost adder. And then we created a lever with the availability to say that we were going to reduce the hurdle rate to a low investment hurdle rate of 7.5%. So those were our 3 levers. And then the final scenario was all 3. So we combined, they're not mutually exclusive, right? So we combined all of them to see what it looked like if we stacked the benefits of both. This is a spoiler. No surprise maybe that we did see the deepest reduction in emissions by 2050 when we stacked all factors. So the rapid advancement of heat pump technology, linear backup requirements, along with the measures to reduce the effective hurdles to heat pump adoption. So the next couple slides are going to dive a little more into the findings around heat pumps. So we already understand, and you heard from Dan, how present-day adoption of heat pump technology is directly related to regional climate. This graphic is showing the share of household fuel technology estimates for the southern versus the northern mid-continent. You can see in green is where you should draw your eye to the heat pumps. And historically, we've seen some organic heat pump adoption in the south as a home heating and cooling technology, but organic adoption being 15%. But we've seen much less adoption of heat pumps in the northern climate, and that's almost exclusively attributable to the unattractive upfront costs. So to capture some of that climate-specific granularity around what strategies were going to be most effective, we broke the mid-continent into 3 regions, and these are corollary to the EIA AEO subregions, and ended up with north, central, and south. As you can see, Michigan is in the north region, and I'll talk through some of the north region specific findings for the next 2 slides. So this graphic, a little busy, but is showing share of device counts or number of installed devices across all households by year. So I'll note, because this is showing share of technologies chosen for installation, it is important to understand that there may be households with more than one device. So for example, when there's a supplementary technology to heat pump, which could be any backup like wood, natural gas, it doesn't indicate consumption from that technology or that technology is being used at the same time. So we know that some technologies like those familiar with ductless mini splits automatically include electricity as an inherent backup. So if that technology was chosen by the model, it would automatically add the backup device as well to the count. So just context. But if we look a little more closely at the graph for the northern region, the largest portion of the graph at left is showing business as usual share of devices from 2020 to 2050 if we do nothing. And here you see that there is kind of this organic moderate increase in heat pump installations, though natural gas, forced air, room air, and central air still dominate the share of devices through to mid-century. So then to investigate those 4 scenarios that I talked us through, which I recognize you guys are thinking 9 years out and I'm showing you 30 years out, but we isolated 2040 to 2050 to see what would have the greatest impact by that time. And you can see each scenario is isolated with that black border to the right. So the key findings here are that each of the levers in isolation did result in heat pump adoption and penetration. And you can see that as the share of green increased across all scenarios. We can note that when the technology is more advanced, so that rapid HP tech scenario, or the hurdle rate is reduced, so the low hurdle rate scenario, we see the most significant impact on heat pump adoption. So if you're looking to pursue one strategy, one of those. However, as I spoiled already, the greatest impact is available when all 3 factors are implemented, so that bar at far right. Breathing to let you sit with this cool graphic. All right, and this, now that I've talked through kind of the mechanics of how this graph works, this is now showing energy consumption by end use and device efficiency. So this is getting a little bit into that energy efficiency conversation. You can see that under business as usual, heating technologies are generally upgraded to become more efficient, but that other than a dip around 2032, the total energy consumption remains relatively constant. However, when we deploy any of the levers in isolation, we see reductions in total energy consumed, as well as supplanting of energy consumption by more efficient devices and heat pumps. And then the greatest reduction in energy, total energy consumption comes when you stack all 3, the rapid HP tech, the linear HP performance, and the low hurdle rate. And you can see that almost all conventional heating, cooling technology, hot water and heat pumps are removed from the scenario by that time, and they've all been upgraded in addition to that energy consumption reduction. So I caveat that it was going to be a whirlwind, and it is. I urge those interested to take a look at the full roadmap because there's a lot of really interesting findings, and it goes deeper into what I've described today. But as if there were a quiz right after this is what you need to know. What are our key takeaways? So first, we found that electric heat pumps do provide the most promising building decarbonization strategy available. However, even so, they didn't quite achieve total decarbonization. So this does indicate what we sort of already know, but it confirms it, that we need to stay vigilant on finding complementary creative solutions. Other fuels like hydrogen or RNG are definitely going to have to play a role in getting us the rest of the way there. We deduced, as did Dan, that energy efficiency is a no-regret strategy. Building shell improvements, which the roadmap did also look at, help curb energy demand and can occur in tandem to other technology deployment. So a situation where throwing all the paint at the wall has true benefit. And similarly, reducing barrier to heat pump adoption can significantly increase adoption. So tactics to reducing adoption barriers are likely going to vary by region. And here we recognize that climate-specific strategy is definitely going to maximize impact. Our findings also explored the heat pump limitations, including those necessary backups for heat pumps in cold climates. And we know that there's a significant opportunity here to utilize some of those emerging alternative fuels like RNG, though, as Dan illustrated, cost does remain a consideration. And finally, emerging fuels like hydrogen, S&G, synthetic natural gas, RNG, renewable natural gas, will be crucial complements to the suite of tactics to achieve building sector decarbonization by mid-century. I think I almost got us back on track. Thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Yeah, that was great, Jesse. Thank you so much. And there's already, I think, some interest in having some conversation. So those were two really great presentations. I know we've got a couple of folks that are interested in sharing some thoughts, and then we're really hoping for some open discussion in this space. Before we kind of hop over to that, I'm just going to remind all of us that this discussion space is for council members. And so people that are participating who aren't council members, we're thrilled to have you. But I'm going to keep the discussion really focused in on our council members themselves. And I know that Marnise had some thoughts. And so I'm going to call on a couple of council members first that we had some discussions with about their input here, and start there. And then hopefully it flows a little further from that discussion. So Marnise, I'm going to call on you first.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Hi, you sound great. Floor is yours.
Okay, I feel like I'm getting a delay. Okay. So yeah, I know I was in the chat, and thanks so much for the presentation. And I know everything is about perspective, but as an advocate for Black and Brown communities, and if we're going to really try to make Michigan a clean, healthy state, we can't proceed accordingly with false solutions. Bio methane is a false solution, and it still contributes to climate change by way of methane. And then also it hurts communities of color and low-income communities because it's concentrated in these communities. So especially in the rural areas. And so that's a whole nother dynamic. So I have to definitely lift that up. We have to start thinking about alternatives. And I understand in his presentation that there was a small amount used. However, and I understand the whole economic is cheaper, right? However, the quicker we stop using it and finding another alternative, the quicker it would die out. The problem is we keep using it, right? Which is going to impact Black and Brown communities. So if we're about a clean, healthy Michigan, we need to start transitioning. So I just wanted to comment.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Marnise. And I know Jim Harrison, I was interested in a little bit of perspective from you as well. And then I know we've got hands up too.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and hi again, everybody. So I am offering a perspective from basically like a worker perspective. A couple of things, Michigan's decarbonization, how it approaches it. I don't think there's a silver bullet in relation to how that happens, and removing infrastructure in communities. There's definitely going to be a cost associated with that, and I think it's important that we balance out how stranded assets are treated in Michigan as it does its transition in building decarb. And including stranded assets is looking at how that affects both the workforce and a highly paid workforce as well in Michigan that reaches across all kinds of folks. I think also moving forward, it's going to depend on a common understanding of how the distribution system responds to volume loss, as well as a better understanding of the associated jobs needed to formalize and certification programs and safety protocols and things like that associated with Michigan's building decarb process. I also agree that the one clear path is energy efficiency. There's tremendous opportunities in energy efficiency, and agree with the concept that that's a no regrets kind of way as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Bernice. I think those are two good perspectives and help us kind of round out what we heard from the presentations. And I know I'm seeing some hands up, and I think there's, I think we're jumping right into lots of good discussion, which is great. So, Peck, you've got your hand up.
Thanks. Just to comment on the issue of biomethane, I would agree that is a troubling issue for me. Not only is it limited in capacity at scale, like we've learned, it's also a moral hazard with respect to the oil and gas industry and keeping that infrastructure going. And I think the ideal is to get the infrastructure shut down as soon as possible from fossil fuels. And I think that we just heard a good reason for that. The second thing I wanted, though, is when we were looking at how to go carbon neutral at the University of Michigan, we hired a consultant to do similar studies. And we came to the conclusion that ground-sourced heat pumps were the way to go. Now, of course, University of Michigan has we're our own community, and we could afford to go community ground source and make up for some of the shortcomings, I suppose, in all the investment that's required. But one of the things that struck me was that even with that a huge initial cost, over a 60-year period, it paid for itself. And of course, the University of Michigan intends to be around a lot longer than 60 more years. And so what I'm wondering is, anyone looked at what it would take to, at least with new construction, to come up with a financial mechanism supported by the public sector, I suppose, build it into the tax rate or something, so that anybody, low income or high income, whatever, could get some money up front and pay it off over a long enough period of time, that ground sourced would be the de facto for new construction. And in doing so, to eliminate our need for any kind of fuel.
So, Peck, I think you've hit on a few different points that are really important. And we're getting into more of I was going to hand it off to Doug Scott at GPI to facilitate a more a discussion about top concerns and around housing and buildings, which you're kind of taking us into. So the first thought I had, and then I'll hand it off to Doug to kind of take us through that. First thought I had is, we do have Michigan Saves, which gives us some opportunity to have that financing mechanism for different types of deployment like this. And so there are some things that are sort of at our disposal. And the question becomes, are we using them to the fullest extent and incenting the right things? And then also, obviously your comments bring to light building codes and how important building codes are in this housing and buildings area in terms of moving a really big ship, which is our building stock here in Michigan. Which is something, if you were asking me one of my top concerns in this area, I would mention building codes. So I'm going to call on Dr. Meadows, and then I'm going to hand it off to Doug to kind of take us through this discussion. But I think we're launching into it quickly.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are I'm probably on the precipice of the old discussion and the new one. A couple of things I wanted to just comment on a question that one of my council members made. And as we do this work, I'm just hoping that we will be very mindful of workforce development. And so even as we think about the best method for Michigan, that we are also capturing the skill sets that are going to be needed and really be proactive about engaging groups who typically are not in this discussion and those communities that generally fare worse. I think being able to reach into those communities when we ultimately get to who gets paid to do this work, right? So I just, that was just a thought that maybe it's a top of mind. And then the second one relates to the last presentation, which I quite didn't get it. So I'm learning as I'm going here, and I appreciate the primers. It's been just fabulous. It makes me want to pick up a book and do more reading. So that's encouraging. But the last presentation, there was something around the low hurdle. Is it the low hurdle? And the low hurdle. And I was wondering, as we're looking at these sort of graphs and displays, are we capturing more buildings, or are we capturing housing? Are they blended together? Should they be separate? Because when I think of housing, I think of the people. And then when I think of buildings, it of course involves people, but it's a different sort of pathway. And so I was just wondering, without sounding like a data wonk, because I'm not, is there a way to sort of distinguish the housing piece in its own right and maybe even capture, because I was wondering when you were listing the variables that comprise that low hurdle, did it include things like home ownership, who owns the home? Because that's ultimately going to be a factor in costs and incentives and all of that to get to all of Michigan. I hope that made sense. But you mentioned a rate of 7%. What is that based on? Yes.
Can I answer?
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, that's
I'm
a great
sorry,
question.
Your name disappeared for me for a second, but Jesse mentioned the 7%. Can you just give me a little bit more sense of what
Absolutely. Yeah. And apologies for maybe this wasn't clear, that the findings from my presentation are specific to residential buildings, so homes. Yes. And the hurdle rate, it is kind of this like amorphous thing. I think the key takeaway is that we assume that like under no change from what we're doing, it's 20%. And then we pretended that policies, other initiatives were enacted such that it dropped to 7.5%. So anything that could happen, it's ambiguous to, what is the specific policy. And I think that's where you have a lot of opportunity to make sure you're driving home equity considerations like tenure and home ownership. But if you have the difficulty to an average Michigan resident of getting a heat pump in their home, you're over, 200% return, right? Like you're much more likely to see them put that than if you do nothing, though you'll see some of that anyway. Does that?
Yes, that really helped. And thank you. Thank you so much for explaining that. Thank you.
Hand it to Doug to take us into the next page, which I think we are straddling really well. And we do need to capture a comment in the chat too, because there's a lot of good stuff going on there.
Yeah, so thank you, Director. So what we want to do is kind of a lightning round. So we want to make sure we're hearing from council members. So there's a question in the agenda, which is your top concern or question with respect to buildings and housing. So for some of you who are deep into this area, it may be like we've just heard in terms of the discussion. For some of you who aren't as steeped in this area, it might be, here's something I would like to know. Here's some more information we'd like to have. So I'm going to call on folks. You can feel free to pass if you want to, but we're trying to make sure that we at least give all of the council members an opportunity to say something about this. So you can, again, feel free to pass if you want to. So I'm gonna go to Ronald Vogelwade first, and then to Samuel Stoper. So Ronald.
Sure, thanks, Doug. So I think from my perspective, I think, there are some different techniques when we look at retrofits. That's the 100-to-1 problem when you look at existing infrastructure and housing versus new build or construction. And so how do we look at not necessarily just efficiency as just straight energy efficiency, but broaden that scope a little bit beyond that from the standpoint of looking at flexible demand, time as a different dimension when we look at efficiency and the ability, because that flexibility is going to be required as we look at additional renewable sources or different infrastructure sources. So virtual batteries, things like that, when we talk about those efficiency levers. And then how do we ease the consumer? We always talk about it's energy efficiency is easy and there's consumer payback, but there is the upfront cost. So how do we look at, you know, the incentivizing and or understanding the consumer issues when we look at those hurdles that are all upfront for the consumer? Yes, the benefits are long term, but how do we get that into the right context, like an expansion of PACE or some of these other things where those costs can be differentiated over or amortized over time? So I think those are some keys as we look at it, especially when you look at some of the efficiency gains in housing systems today. You know, for example, for our products, you know, some are 80% down in energy efficiency, and your refrigerator uses as much as a 60-watt incandescent light bulb. So we think of them as being huge efficiency gains still available, but how do we look at that differently in some of these other attributes? So I think that's the key is, yes, there are some available there, but how do we look at the retrofits in a much broader context?
Hey, thanks, Ron. I should tell folks too that we're capturing all of these thoughts, and we think it'll be helpful to the work group as they're trying to, you know, make their recommendations. It'll be helpful for them to be able to address the way you're looking at this and also the questions that you have. So Samuel, and then Darrell Slaughter.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I guess two things come immediately to mind, although I think a lot of what other folks, especially Marnese, brought up is really important. The two things I have in mind, one, are questions. One is, okay, if energy efficiency is really important, what is it that what are the binding constraints to people actually investing in energy efficiency in homes, in commercial buildings, et cetera? It could be purely upfront costs, you know, inability to access financing, or just, you know, not having the cash to afford upfront something that will ultimately save you money. But it's also likely in part awareness and information. And it may or may not have anything to do with education. I mean, I don't know anything about the economics of heat pumps. I pay a lot of money for heat personally, and potentially that's something that I should have invested in long ago. But so, and then you got your split incentives problems for renters who won't get to, you know, reap all the savings down the road of their investment in something more energy efficient, because they're not going to live there forever, or because their rental rates will rise when more energy efficient and thus more attractive attributes are made a part of their home. So understanding what those constraints are, why we haven't already gotten more of this, especially if it's, you know, kind of win-win, if it helps, if it saves you money privately, is really important. Then there was a rigorous and also controversial study a few years ago, a randomized experiment that in energy efficiency take-up, giving subsidies and support and an audit to figure out what are the things that should be invested in, you know, upgraded in your home, and there was really low take-up, and the savings weren't as much as we might hope them to be. And I want to stress that was a controversial study. A lot of people, I think, disagree with or are incredulous. But that's the type of thing. I'm not saying we need to run multi-year randomized controlled trials here, but talking to folks, talking to community members, to people who can answer the question of why haven't you taken up this particular investment, talking to experts like my colleague Tony Reams, et cetera, seems really important here. And then, since that took longer than I intended, the second thing is just at some point I think that the long-term solution is electrification, decarbonization, and I don't think we should overinvest in energy efficiency when in the long run they're not so complementary. We could, if we can electrify everything and decarbonize that grid, that seems there's a logic that's the thing that we should be spending our money on. Thanks, Doug.
Okay. Thank you. I see KCD has a hand up. Is that Carrie Dugan?
Yes, sir, but I don't want to jump on. I'm just trying to file my hand in there.
Well, that's okay. If you want to go ahead now, that's fine.
Since my internet's working okay for the moment. Knock wood.
Jump on while it's hot. There you go.
I probably echo a lot of what I've heard from the other council members here, but inherently, I think we're talking about behavior change, on the residential side. And I have spent the last couple of years really considering the barriers, particularly in low income and communities of color. I totally agree that inviting Tony Reams in this conversation would be really important, because free doesn't get the job done. Okay. Even when the measures are free, and I'm sorry, I have a toddler that just walked in my office, but I'm on a call. The other thing I want to say is it's not just all about just the efficiency. There's other considerations. So I know that Liesel's team has been working to take sort of a systems view through all of the working groups of the council. But, in Detroit where I live, there's a walkway problem, pretty significant one, even when you have a, utility energy efficiency program. If a home has lead or asbestos or doesn't have a roof, it's, they're going to not be able to come in the home, number one. Number two, we're in the middle of a pandemic. They might not want to come in the home. And three, the measures won't matter if there's no roof on the house. So there's just, I think, a lot of attention that needs to be paid at some of the real, besides the financial barriers, some of the behavior considerations, particularly in low-income communities and communities of color. So I just wanted to file that. I think it's also got a real opportunity space. I'm sort of obsessed with residential efficiency. Ask Ron. We spend time talking about this. I think it's like water in Michigan, could be a really great unifier if we can get it right. Could be across party lines. These are kitchen table issues. So if I had to steer the council to really focus on anything, it would be on residential efficiency and sort of those more systemic issues that are attached to it. Going on mute.
Thank you. Let me go to Darrell, because I promised and I went out of turn there, and then I'll grab the folks that have got their hand up in the participants. So Darrell.
Thanks, Doug, and no problem. I agree with a lot of what folks have already said. I just have 3 points I want to bring up. So, I think as we're thinking about recommendations for buildings and housing, and we're going to be getting more information, but I think, as others have said, that I think we need to be looking at like solutions that don't involve biogas or fossil fuel. I think we should be looking at heat pumps for all the reasons that we just talked about. And I know that some folks will talk about some of the cost considerations. My other points will be that I think there needs to be a tremendous amount of effort to educate folks about heat pumps. I think what you're seeing, and even contractors, from the folks I've been talking with in terms of adoption of heat pumps, they just don't understand it, and and that comes from the person who's potentially buying it, but also the folks who would be installing it and selling it. So there needs to be a lot of efforts around educating folks about heat pumps and all the benefits there. And then lastly, I would just say that I think we need to do some work around getting some actual mechanisms in our state that will support and help the deployment of electrification of homes. Right now, I think there's some misalignment in terms of our current policies, especially around heat pumps, looking at, how, for example, our EWR programs work. And, there's just not a lot there in terms of supporting, I think, expansion of heat pumps. So those are just some of my top of the mind thoughts. And then also workforce. We're going to need a workforce to actually deploy it. And Black and brown folks should definitely be a big part of that workforce development conversation.
Great. Thanks, Darrell. Let me go to Cynthia Williams. Come forward.
Sure. And I think we need to work on a solution for now, near, and far. And it should be a range of technologies that, folks could choose, based on income or whatnot. And one of the things I heard Dan mention earlier, there was a hydrogen gas pilots that are occurring in Massachusetts. I would like to understand if we could get, as part of this group, an update on those pilots, because I'd like to understand what's the potential for that technology moving forward, and because I think it could have an impact on what we decide and what we recommend to this committee. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Marnice Jackson, you've got your hand up.
Hi, I'm back. So I wanted to get back in there, and thanks so much for lifting up energy burden. KCD, thanks so much for lifting that up, because I think we need to also consider accountability with landlords and focusing on multi-units and low-income housing. I want to get away from saying affordable housing, because that's not really empowering, in my opinion. But We have to assess the community needs and understand the barriers preventing communities from electrifying their homes, i.e. the money, right? Because at the end of the day, this is going to come down to the money, and people on the ground don't always have access to these funds or even know that these things are out there. I worked in a community action agency about doing weatherization, and so I I know that people just don't know about these things. And also, we're council members, we're at the state level. However, these decisions honestly have to come from the community. They need input here because they're actually going through these issues with poor indoor air quality. They have to be a part of this decision-making process. And then for us, we have to develop metrics for tracking, right? Because say if we start to focus a lot on implementing energy efficiency across the state of Michigan, we have to track this for improvement, right? For later, right? Because we're not going to hit everybody in one bucket in the next 9 years. Let's be realistic, right? I know that's ambitious. We would love to, but we have to be honest. Like, we have to figure out a way to track our progress, and then also focusing on hiring people to actually do this, local people, right? I'm really not into hiring people who already up here. We need to start employing people who are who have businesses locally, and that will grow our economy. So I'm just want to put a lot of different things out there.
Thank you, Marnise. Mary Draves has her hand up, and then I'm going to go to Phil Roos after that.
Yeah, Doug, thanks. I think one of the things we've talked about a number of different topics. One of the things that I think is important for us to also consider is the idea of there are a whole host of products that we can use in opportunity to decarbonize, and I think Ron sort of touched on that a little bit. You talk about new builds, retrofits. What is it that we're using? What products are we using? I think there's a lot of discussion about, we all talk about scope 1, scope 2, the next, scope 3, and you'll hear some of our leadership talk about, what could be the scope 4, the contributions that products make. I think there's a really important aspect of this as we look at, especially in buildings and construction, that, hey, how do you incentivize people to use low carbon products in potential new builds, or as Marnise says, how do you look at incentivizing them to improve the condition of a home using products that help decarbonize or themselves are low carbon. So I think we just want to make sure that we think about that also. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Phil, and then we'll go to Tanya Kozlowski after that.
Okay, hi everybody.
Hey.
I'm sorry, I'm having a really bad echo on my end. Now I know it's on my end because I'll try to blurt this out.
We're hearing you fine, Phil.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me still?
Yep.
Okay. I have just more things that more questions than answers or point of views here. It's really breathtaking. I mean, it seems like I would really like to know where the bottlenecks are a little bit more precisely in terms of moving toward full electrification as soon as possible. Their peak load impacts and cost impacts, but I just wish I understood that better. And then in terms of just the overall, like, what's the biggest challenge? It's already been said, but financial incentives to do retrofits or upgrades or heat pumps, financial incentives and just inertia that gets in the way of that. And so really understanding the scope of the costs for those, which I'm sure is embedded in some of the modeling that's already shown. But what are the economics as we evolve towards scale, and sort of quantifying what is what's the dollar value of what needs to be done in people's homes and commercial buildings. So is this a financing question? Is it a PPP alternative, but for buildings to move toward electrification? understanding what that total dollar value is. That's what's sort of on my mind and getting my hands wrapped around it. Sorry?
Doug,
You're
I
on
think
mute, Doug.
you're on mute.
I think I'm next, Doug, but I want to give you a chance to jump in if you want to.
You're good, Tanya.
Okay. I just appreciate all this input. It's given me a lot to think about that wasn't on my mind right offhand. I'm going to start with a recommendation. Some of you energy nerds probably regularly listen to the Energy Gang. But they're, you know, have some wonderful thinkers in the energy space that are the hosts of that program. And they did one on building decarbonization. It might have been 2 weeks ago that I thought did a really good job of providing an overview of this issue. So for those who are looking for something that's, you know, fun to do while you're driving or walking, I do recommend that podcast. I thought it was really some valuable context. Specific to our work here, I have a couple of things that come to mind. One, back to Dr. Reams and his great work. I want to, you know, pile on to the importance of the issues that I know he has raised around data and looking at how we can focus on where these types of technologies can have the biggest impact. So looking at the communities that are most in need, I think that's aligning the concept of energy burden with the need for efficiency. That includes the need to make sure that the housing stock can support actual lower bills or can actually support the efficiency work. But I don't know that we have the data today to be able to identify the places where we can make the most impact. So that is one request that I have. Want to add to that the importance of the technology in addition to heat pumps, in addition to energy efficiency. I know Charlotte raised the concept of demand response. And I think there's an aspect of just technology that allows, without people needing to do a lot, but can still automatically save them money if they have the right technology installed as part of this work. So I want to include that in how we might think of that in terms of the other pieces that we're talking about. And then my final one is on the workforce issues. It is my understanding that even where there are attempts to subsidize heat pumps, the traditional workforce in heating and cooling, the heating and cooling space, because they are not familiar with this technology, are not presenting it to customers when people call. And obviously these are things that people replace often in an emergency situation because their furnace has gone out. So in addition to absolutely supporting the idea of bringing the workforce in for the communities that are being served, just want to add to that the need to potentially incentivize and/or, I know there's an education component, but it's almost a you know, rethinking what heating and cooling looks like in this new space and bringing that existing workforce along as well. So thank you. Sorry, that was a bit
Thanks,
long-winded.
Tanya. I apologize for being muted before. Brandon Hoffmeister, and then I want to go to Director Beaver.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of the comments of the board members. I think for me, the single biggest concern is just how do we maintain affordability and equity as we transition to clean energy. You know, it's critically important to think about affordability and reliability as a natural gas provider and an electric provider. We also think about the safety needs of the gas system while it's still going to be running for quite some time. And, you know, so prioritizing cost-effective abatement options. I think the point that was made about the impact of peak demand on the electric system is also a big issue that we're starting to understand a little better at consumers, and it has a pretty eye-popping impact given the relative energy density that natural gas has today. the amount of electricity demand to get through some of those winter peak times is pretty staggering, to be honest. It has a huge affordability component as well. So just really being thoughtful as we dive into this issue of how do we prioritize this really hard transition, and try to come up with something that's best for Michigan and is affordable for to keep businesses competitive and to keep our homeowners energy prices something that's affordable. That's my single biggest worry beat.
Great. Thanks. Director Beaver, and then I'll go to Dr. Meadows. She's got her hand up, and then we'll probably be out of time. So.
And in the interest of time and keeping it brief, since I'm learning a lot and hearing a lot of very interesting perspectives, I'll pass at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Dr. You'll notice the method of my madness. I tried to call on the non-governmental folks just to try to get folks' thoughts there. We may have to start with the governmental folks next time when we do a lightning round. But Dr. Meadows, go ahead, and then I'll turn it back to.
See, I was actually going to pass too because I know we were winding down. But the only thing that's on top of mind for me is I listened to my colleagues, and I could just pretty much put a ditto on many of the things that I've said that I've understood. There's some things that I don't quite understand about the energy sources, but I'm trusting the experts. But I was just kind of concerned about, Brandon mentioned it, the prioritizing this. As we move this whole agenda forward, because it's big, are there some low-hanging fruits that we need to be thinking about in an actionable way? And then I always get concerned when I see multiple work groups, because what's top of mind for me is how does this come together in a cohesive whole? And are we going to be operationalizing this in segments or as a collective genre? So that, and then my last is, all of this has policy implications. And I would hope with the initiative this big, that we can be thoughtful about making sure that we get the voices of the people, the consumers, and especially those who are typically not asked. And before we make any recommendations, how do we vet this so that it's realistic? And that's all. Sorry.
No, that's fine, Dr. Meadows. Thank you. That's actually, it's a nice segue to go back to Director Clark and to, if she wants to say a few words about the process and the questions you raised, and otherwise talk about next steps.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Doug. And honestly, before we leave the conversation on this topic, I actually wanted to ask Treasurer Eubanks if she had any thoughts, because
Great.
I'm glad that we started with the non-state of Michigan council members. I think creates a richer discussion. But just with her background, I think many of you know, she served on the Public Service Commission, and now she serves as our treasurer. And,
Right.
With her perspective, I just think would be helpful here because she looks at a lot from the finance angle too. So Rachel, I was just wondering if you had anything you thought was useful to raise up.
Thanks, and my apologies, Treasurer. I should have called on you. Thank you.
Oh gosh, no problem. And thanks for the chance to chime in with a few thoughts. First, I certainly appreciate all the sociological concerns that are up. Those are very important. But I think what's also important is the financing investment pieces. I was happy to hear the speakers be very mindful of some of the investments the state has made in the past, either the state or ratepayers in the state, and trying to reuse some of the infrastructure. And thinking about, how we're going to make that transition from a financial perspective, because from Treasury is involved in this specifically because of the impact on local governments. And I think a lot of the energy generation facilities that we have in these communities that I think is certainly in one hand challenging from a climate perspective, is also incredibly important from a tax-based perspective, from an employment-based perspective. From these individuals. So kind of keeping those things in mind as we're, kind of working through what those priorities are, I think are important, are going to make sure that we're making the best use of dollars. Same thing for the ratepayer perspective and the stranded costs. I think that's an important mindset to have as well. So those are kind of my initial thoughts. As far as the financing and the energy efficiency side, I agree. That's a really interesting conversation and something that we should think about more. I think we've got some great, kind of starts in the state as far as the Michigan Saves program and the PACE program and other things that we've talked about. But, is there a role for an expansion in a, kind of a public infrastructure bank or something along those lines to kind of help us as a state to get over these hurdles? I think those are some of the things I would love to be able to focus on as we move forward.
Thank you, ma'am. Always thoughtful. And I'm not going to go into any great depth, but I would say the issue of multi-use dwelling and making sure that our incentives are aligned is really important to me, as well as building codes, as I've raised up a couple of times. I think that, we heard a variety of themes in this space that, in my mind, help us think. We've got to think about policy, we've got to think about technology, and then we've got to think about the market. And how those things interweave, give us different levers to take us into the future. But they're all important, right? So we spent a lot of time talking about heat pumps and then the outcomes there. And so that technology piece, plays into what we're able to do. And there are certainly some technology questions that we don't really have answered, as we heard from the first council meeting. So, okay, I want to just be cognizant of time. So before I send you off, I'm just going to say, again, a deep amount of appreciation to the team that brought together today, our presenters for sure, our team at Eagle, the GPI team have been supporting us, and really, the important work of the work groups as part of this discussion. But I can't leave it without saying how grateful I am to you council members for giving of your time and energy and your wisdom through the course of this process. So it's been a really good discussion today. So we worked to capture the conversation as it was happening. We'll capture the chat. This is recorded, so if you know folks that want to check it out, we'll post it on the website and people can see it there. We'll also post slides. We'll share slides with council members. Our next meeting is May 25th, and then you can see the materials here in terms of contacting us if there are folks that are watching who haven't been able to contact us. There's a lot of information at michigan.gov/climate. So with that, we did pretty well with staying on time. I'm so grateful for the deep conversation. Thanks everybody for your time today, and we'll see you again in a month. Thanks so much.
Thank you.